On Guadalcanal, the United States Navy faced a problem its torpedoes could not solve. The enemy was not always a battleship. It was not always a cruiser sliding through the dark with searchlights ready and destroyers guarding its flanks. Sometimes the enemy was smaller, slower, lower in the water, and far harder to kill than anyone had expected. It was a barge, a squat Japanese landing craft crawling along the coast at night, carrying soldiers, rice, ammunition, and fuel through black water that larger American warships could not safely enter. By day, those barges would have been easy prey. By night, close to shore in shallow water, they became one of the most frustrating targets in the Pacific War. The PT boats were built for speed and torpedoes. Their reason for existing was to rush close to a large enemy ship, fire their fish, and disappear before the target's guns could tear them apart. But the barges were too shallow for the torpedoes and too tough for ordinary machine gun fire. A torpedo could run cleanly beneath them. A .50 caliber round could spark against metal plate and fail to stop them. Again and again, the little Japanese craft slipped through. So the Americans began to improvise. They looked around the islands for anything that could hit harder than a machine gun and fire faster than a single-shot anti-tank weapon. The answer did not come from a factory. It did not come from a polished design office in Washington. At first, it came from wreckage. At Henderson Field, among the broken aircraft left after weeks of bombing, shelling, crashes, and combat, there were Bell P-39 era Cobras. The P-39 had been designed around an unusual weapon, a 37mm automatic cannon mounted in the nose, firing through the center of the propeller hub. In the air, the aircraft had been controversial. At low altitude, it could be useful, but without a turbo supercharger, it struggled high above the battlefield, where Japanese bombers and fighters often held the advantage. In the Solomons, some P-39s fought, some were damaged, some were destroyed, and some ended up as wrecks near the airfield. But inside those wrecks sat something the PT crews desperately needed: a compact 37mm automatic cannon. Not a torpedo, not a heavy naval gun, not a perfect weapon, but a weapon that could punch into a barge. This is not the story of one genius who solved the war in a single night. History is rarely that clean. Similar experiments appeared on different fronts because the same problem appeared everywhere, in Japanese barges moving at night through shallow coastal waters, carrying the supplies that kept isolated forces alive. In the Solomons and along New Guinea, men under pressure reached for similar answers. Some mounted single-shot army guns. Some added 20mm cannon. Some later carried 40mm Bofors guns. Over time, the PT boat changed from a pure torpedo craft into something heavier, uglier, and more useful in the war it was actually fighting. But the 37mm aircraft cannon was one of the turning points. It was a bridge between what the PT boats had been designed to do and what the Pacific forced them to become. And to understand why desperate men would cut a cannon from an airplane and bolt it to the deck of a wooden boat, you have to go back to the night Guadalcanal seemed to be breaking apart. The date was October 14, 1942. In the waters around Guadalcanal, the darkness had weight. Men remembered those nights not as empty darkness, but as something thick and alive, filled with engine sounds, gun flashes, wakes, flares, and fear. The Americans had a name for the water north of the island: Iron Bottom Sound. It had earned that name quickly. Ships had already gone down there, and more would follow. The Marines held Henderson Field, the rough airstrip that had become the center of the entire campaign. As long as Henderson Field could launch aircraft during the day, Japanese ships could not move freely in daylight. The planes of the Cactus Air Force, Marine, Navy, and Army aircraft operating from the field made every Japanese daylight run a gamble. So the Japanese came by night. Destroyers, cruisers, and transports ran down the slot under cover of darkness. The Americans called these runs the Tokyo Express. Sometimes they brought troops, sometimes they brought food and ammunition, sometimes they came with guns. On the night of October 13, into the morning of October 14, the Japanese sent something much heavier than barges. The battleships Congo and Haruna came down toward Guadalcanal with escorts. Their purpose was simple: smash Henderson Field so badly that it could not interfere with the coming Japanese operations. At about 1:30 in the morning, their great guns opened fire. The men on Guadalcanal heard a sound that did not belong to ordinary shelling. It was too large, too deep. The shells came in from offshore and tore into the airfield, supply areas, revetments, fuel dumps, and living spaces. For more than an hour, Henderson Field was hammered by 14-inch naval gunfire. The bombardment wrecked aircraft, cratered the runway, burned fuel, killed men, and left the airfield in a condition that made many wonder whether it could keep operating at all. Across the water at Tulagi, the PT boat crews were awakened by the thunder. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had only recently reached the area. This was not the famous original Squadron 3 from the Philippines, the squadron associated with John D. Bulkley and the evacuation of General Douglas MacArthur from Corregidor. That earlier squadron had been used up in desperate fighting. The Squadron 3 now at Tulagi was a new unit carrying the same number, a fact that even caused administrative confusion in the Navy. It was built around boats brought forward for the Solomons campaign, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Allen R. Montgomery. On October 14, 4 of those boats got underway: PT-38, PT-46, PT-48, and PT-60. They were small wooden craft entering a sea full of large enemy ships. Each boat was fast, but speed was not armor. They had torpedoes, but torpedoes required nerve, distance, timing, and luck. They had machine guns, but machine guns could not win a duel with a destroyer's main battery. The crews moved out in the dark, guided by the orange flashes of Japanese guns. They were not sailing into a neat battle. They were entering confusion. Searchlights cut through the night. Ships appeared and vanished. Wakes crossed. Boats separated. One officer saw what he believed was a cruiser and fired torpedoes at close range. Others saw explosions and believed hits had been scored. In the reports afterward, the squadron claimed torpedo hits, and there were rumors and enemy broadcasts that seemed to suggest damage. But the reliable conclusion is more cautious. There was no conclusive evidence that any major Japanese ship was sunk that night. That distinction matters. The crews were not cowards. They did attack, they did close the range, they did fire, they did what PT boats were supposed to do in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. But they could not stop the bombardment, and they could not prevent the Japanese from returning again. The result was not a clean victory. It was one more night in which the courage of men in small boats collided with the brutal limits of the weapons they carried. That is the first truth of this story. The PT boats did not become legends because everything worked. They became legends because so much did not. Henderson Field survived, but survival was not the same as safety. The field had been torn apart. Aircraft were burned, broken, or damaged. Men were dead. Fuel had been lost. The runway had to be patched again under pressure. The island remained in danger. And scattered near the airfield, Among the machines that could no longer fly were wrecked aircraft. Some of them were P-39 Airacobras. The P-39 was an unusual fighter. Most fighters placed the engine in the nose. The Airacobra placed its engine behind the pilot, near the center of the aircraft, with a long drive shaft running forward beneath the cockpit to turn the propeller. That arrangement made room in the nose for the aircraft's main weapon, a 37-millimeter cannon firing through the propeller hub. It was an aircraft built around a gun. That gun, the Oldsmobile-built M4 37-millimeter automatic cannon, was not there as decoration. It was the heart of the design. It gave the P-39 a punch many fighters did not have. Against the right target and at the right range, it could hit hard. But the aircraft around it had limitations. Early design choices left the P-39 without the high-altitude performance that many pilots needed. In some theaters, especially where air combat happened at lower altitudes, the P-39 found useful work. In the high-altitude air battles that often mattered in the Pacific, it could struggle. On Guadalcanal, the Cactus Air Force fought with what it had, not always with what it wanted. Wildcats, Dauntlesses, P-400s, P-39s, and other aircraft took off from an airstrip that was bombed, shelled, muddy, and constantly under repair. Pilots flew tired, mechanics worked with limited tools, fuel was precious. Spare parts were never enough. In that environment, aircraft died in many ways. Some were shot down. Some were destroyed on the ground. Some were damaged beyond quick repair. Some were dragged aside because keeping the field open mattered more than preserving a wreck. To most men, those broken P-39s were losses. The PT crews, eventually, they became a source of weapons. The problem that forced this change was not the battleship. PT boats had been designed, in theory, to attack warships. The deeper and more persistent problem was the barge war. A Japanese Daihatsu landing craft was not impressive at first glance. It was not fast like a destroyer. It did not carry huge guns. It did not look like the kind of craft that could shape a campaign. But wars are often decided by the movement of ordinary things: rice, ammunition, medicine, fuel, replacement troops, radio batteries, artillery shells. A barge could carry those things. The Japanese had learned that large ships were vulnerable to American aircraft during the day, so they moved supplies by night, and by small craft, hugging coastlines and using shallow water. Barges could unload in places where deep draft ships could not go. They could be hidden under trees, they could be dispersed, they could move in groups. If one was lost, others might get through. For American PT crews, the barge was maddening. The standard Mark 8 torpedo was a ship-killing weapon from an older generation. It was heavy and powerful, carrying a large explosive warhead. Against a destroyer, cruiser, transport, or submarine, a torpedo hit could be devastating. But a torpedo ran below the surface at a set depth. A shallow draft barge did not extend far enough beneath the water. A torpedo could pass under it without contact. Machine guns were easier to use, but they lacked the punch needed against protected barges. Some Japanese barges carried armor or steel, plating enough to resist small arms fire and reduce the effect of .50 caliber machine guns. The PT crews could rake a barge with fire and still fail to stop it quickly enough. This created a cruel gap. The weapon powerful enough to destroy a ship ran too deep for the target. The weapon that could hit the target lacked the power to reliably destroy it. So the crews improvised. Before the aircraft cannon became a practical answer, some boats carried Army 37-millimeter anti-tank guns. The M3 was a real gun with a real punch, but it was single shot. On land, with a crew dug in and a clear field of fire, It had a purpose. On the bow of a bouncing wooden PT boat at night, it was awkward and dangerous. After each shot, someone had to reload by hand. Seconds mattered. The barge might be shooting back. Other barges might be moving past. The boat might be turning, accelerating, or taking fire. And one of the most famous PT boats in history carried one of these improvised guns, PT-109. Her commander was Lieutenant Junior Grade John F. Kennedy. Before PT-109 was rammed and sunk by the Japanese destroyer Amagiri in August 1943, her crew had lashed a single-shot Army 37mm anti-tank gun to the bow. It was not the P-39 automatic cannon. It was not the final answer. It was part of the same desperate search for more firepower. That detail is important because legends often compress history until everything becomes too neat. Kennedy's PT-109 was not carrying the elegant solution. It was carrying a crude attempt. The crew knew they needed more than machine guns. They knew barges were hard to kill. They knew a bigger shell might help. But a single-shot anti-tank gun on a wooden bow was not enough. The better answer was the automatic aircraft cannon. The M4 from the P-39 had a magazine holding 30 rounds. It could fire much faster than a hand-loaded anti-tank gun. It delivered the same general caliber of shell, but in repeated fire. For a PT boat closing a barge in the dark, that mattered enormously. One shell might miss. One shell might hit the wrong part of the target. One shell might fail to stop the engine. But a burst of 37mm fire could smash, tear, and ignite. It could make the barge stop being a moving supply line and become a burning object on the water. Removing the gun from a wrecked aircraft was not simple. The P-39's cannon was part of the airplane's structure and systems. It had not been designed to be lifted out easily by boat crews working at a forward base. Men had to salvage what they could, free bolts and fittings, handle parts damaged by combat or crash, and then build mounts strong enough to hold the weapon on a PT boat. A cannon produces recoil. A PT boat deck was not a battleship turret. It was wood, metal fittings, improvised brackets, and the hurried work of men who needed the weapon before the next night patrol. There was risk in the first installations. A gun that works in an aircraft does not automatically work on a boat. The movement is different. The mounting is different. The angles are different. The crew position is different. Salt water, vibration, darkness, and corrosion all change the problem. The gun had to be aimed, fed, maintained, and fired in conditions for which it had not been designed. But necessity was a better teacher than doctrine. When the gun worked, it changed the barge fight. A PT boat with a 37mm automatic cannon could approach a barge and deliver hard, repeated fire at the waterline, the engine compartment, or the troop space. It could do what a torpedo could not do, hit the shallow target directly. It could do what the .50 caliber guns often struggled to do, punch harder into protected craft. It did not make the PT boat invincible. It did not end the barge war overnight. It gave the crews a weapon that matched the enemy they were actually facing. That was the pattern of the Pacific War at the small boat level. The official design met the real battlefield. The battlefield exposed the weakness. The men closest to the problem modified the machine. If the modification worked, the Navy eventually noticed and standardized it. The PT boat began the war as a torpedo craft. By the middle and later stages of the war, many boats carried a wide mix of weapons. .50 caliber machine guns, 20mm Oerlikons, 37mm cannon, 40mm Bofors guns, rockets, mortars, and extra armor where possible. The boat became less pure and more useful. It became what the war required. The 37mm gun was not the final stage. In many ways, the 40mm Bofors became a more powerful and preferred barge-killing weapon. It hit harder and became common on many gunboat-style PTs. But the salvaged aircraft cannon was a crucial step. It proved that a PT boat could be something more than a torpedo delivery system. It showed that speed, darkness, and automatic cannon fire could make a small wooden boat dangerous to the small craft that kept Japanese positions supplied. The story becomes even more meaningful because it does not belong to one place alone. In the Solomons, PT crews faced Japanese barges moving between islands, across channels, and along coastlines. In New Guinea, the same kind of war unfolded along a different shore. Japanese forces used barges to move at night because larger ships and daylight movements had become too dangerous. American and Allied forces responded with aircraft, PT boats, ambushes, and heavier guns. The details varied, but the tactical problem was the same: stop the small craft that kept the enemy alive. That is why the myth of a single inventor is less powerful than the truth. A lone genius story is easy to sell, but the real story is wider and more human. Men on different fronts saw the same failure and reached for similar tools. Some tried them earlier, some later. Some experiments were crude, some failed, some became standard. The war did not reward clean invention. It rewarded whatever could survive the next patrol. And every patrol was dangerous. A PT boat was fast, but it was still wooden. Its engines burned gasoline. A hit in the wrong place could turn the boat into a fireball. Searchlights could freeze it in enemy vision. Destroyers could fire shells that landed close enough to lift a boat out of the water. Aircraft could strafe or bomb. Coral reefs could tear out a bottom. Engines could fail. Torpedoes could miss or malfunction. Radar, when available, could help, but early in the Guadalcanal campaign, many boats operated with limited detection capability, relying on eyes, ears, Coast Watcher reports, and luck. The crews were young, many were barely old enough to have lived much of a life before the war. They learned quickly because the ocean punished slow learners. They slept when they could, repaired engines by day, loaded ammunition, patched holes, cleaned guns, and went back out at night. On December 9, 1942, one of those PT actions showed what the boats could still do when the right target appeared. PT-59, then under Lieutenant Junior Grade John M. Searles, was patrolling with PT-44 off Guadalcanal. They encountered activity near Camimbo Bay and came upon the Japanese submarine I-3, which had surfaced as part of a supply operation. Against a submarine, the PT boat's torpedo was still the right weapon. Searles fired, and the submarine was destroyed. It was a dramatic success, the kind of action that proved the PT concept had not been useless. But the sea did not allow long celebrations. Only days later, PT-44 was destroyed by Japanese destroyers. That was the rhythm of the campaign: success, loss, repair, exhaustion, and return to the water. The same boats that could kill a submarine could be shattered by destroyer gunfire. The same crews that could burn barges one night could lose friends the next. The barge war continued into 1943, and the PT boats became more heavily armed. The Japanese also adapted. Barges might be escorted, they might be hidden better, they might move in different patterns. The Americans added weapons and changed tactics. The enemy changed in response. There was no final solution, only the next adjustment. This is where PT-59 re-enters the story in a new form. The same hull number that had belonged to Searles's submarine-killing boat later became associated with John F. Kennedy. After PT-109 was lost in August 1943, Kennedy survived a brutal ordeal. His boat had been cut in half by Amagiri. 2 men were killed. Kennedy and the survivors endured days on small islands before rescue. He emerged famous in the records of the PD force, but also physically damaged. His back, already troubled before the war, had been worsened. He was exhausted and ill. Yet he wanted another command. He was given PT-59. By then, the Navy had learned a hard lesson. In the Solomons, a PT boat did not always need torpedoes as much as it needed guns. PT-59 was converted into a gunboat. Her torpedo tubes were removed. Heavier automatic weapons were installed, including 40-millimeter guns and additional machine guns. Armor shields were added around some gun positions. The result was no longer a classic torpedo boat. It was a fast, shallow water gun platform. That change tells the story better than any speech could. The Navy took a patrol torpedo boat and removed the torpedoes. Not because torpedoes had never worked. They had. Against the right target, they remained deadly. But against the targets now shaping the campaign, barges, shore positions, small craft, and night traffic, guns were often more useful. PT-59 became part of that evolution. Kennedy reported to PT-59 in September 1943, and the boat was converted over several weeks. By October, she was operating from Lambu Cove on Vella La Vella in the northern Solomons. The war had moved north and west from Guadalcanal, but the pattern remained. Japanese troops and supplies were moving by barge, and the PT boats hunted them at night. Then came Operation Blissful. The name sounded almost gentle. The mission was not. In late October 1943, Marine parachutists under Lieutenant Colonel Victor H. Krulak went ashore on Choiseul Island. The operation was a diversion connected to the planned Allied landing on Bougainville. The idea was to make the Japanese believe Choiseul was a major target, drawing attention and possibly troops away from the real objective. Krulak, a tough Marine officer nicknamed the Brute, commanded a force that was small compared with the Japanese presence nearby. His men raided, moved, fought, and tried to create the impression of a larger operation. But diversionary raids can become real disasters. Some Marines became cut off near the Warrior River. They were tired, hungry, wounded, and threatened by Japanese forces closing in. They needed extraction. PT boats were called to help. Kennedy's PT-59 was not fully fueled. The boat had only about 1/3 of a tank. In normal terms, that was not enough for the entire trip out and back. But war does not always offer normal terms. Kennedy and another PT boat went anyway, with the understanding that PT-59 might have to be towed home if the fuel ran out. The scene near the Warrior River was chaotic. Landing craft were involved in the evacuation. Rain fell. Japanese fire came from shore. One craft was damaged. Men were trying to get off the beach and out of the danger zone. Kennedy brought PT-59 in and placed the gunboat between the shore and the men being evacuated. The boat took Marines aboard from the landing craft. Exhausted men were given canned peaches, the first real food some had tasted in days. One wounded Marine died in Kennedy's bunk. Then, during the return across the channel, PT-59 ran out of fuel and had to be towed back. It was not a polished movie ending, it was better than that. It was real. A converted gunboat, commanded by a future president, went out short of fuel to help surrounded Marines, used its hull and guns as protection, brought men off under danger, fed them what food it had, carried a dying man, and had to be dragged home in the dark because the fuel gauge had told the truth from the beginning. That is the kind of detail history gives you when you stop trying to make it cleaner than it was. Kennedy did not remain in command much longer. He continued patrols for a short period, including barge hunting operations around Choiseul. But by November 1943, his health was failing. He had lost weight, was exhausted, and was ordered to the hospital at Tulagi. He left the Solomons before the end of the year and eventually left the Navy on physical disability. The PT boats continued without him. By then, the transformation was clear. The boats that had entered the war as torpedo craft were becoming weapons platforms adapted to the island war. In one place, a salvaged P-39 cannon might be mounted on the bow. In another, a 40-millimeter Bofors might be bolted to the stern. Elsewhere, rockets or extra 20-millimeter guns might appear. The boats became crowded with weapons because their crews had learned that survival depended on firepower as much as speed. This transformation did not mean the Navy bureaucracy was always wise or fast. No wartime system is perfect. But the story is not simply frontline men versus stupid officials. That version is satisfying, but too simple. The real arc is more interesting. Field improvisations proved what was needed. Reports moved. Trials followed. Designs changed. By 1944, 37-millimeter cannon of improved naval form were being installed more formally on PT boats. What had begun as salvage and improvisation became accepted equipment. That matters because war is not won by improvisation alone. Improvisation can save men tonight. Standardization can save men next month. The first crew that bolts a salvaged cannon to a deck takes a risk. The next crew benefits if the mount is improved. The next squadron benefits if spare parts, ammunition, supply, training, and manuals begin to catch up. The factory-built version may lack the romance of the field modification, but it is often what turns a clever answer into a reliable weapon. The PT boats needed both kinds of courage, the courage to improvise and the discipline to make the improvisation repeatable. The Japanese noticed the change. They had always respected and feared small craft that appeared suddenly in darkness. PT boats were difficult targets, low, fast, and dangerous at close range. The Japanese nickname, devil boats, became part of the way the PT force was remembered. Whether every enemy used the phrase in the same way matters less than the reality behind it. By 1943, American PT boats were a serious threat to Japanese night movement in the islands. The barges still ran. Some got through. Men and supplies still reached Japanese positions. No weapon stopped everything. But the cost rose. A barge that had once counted on darkness and shallow water now had to fear a fast boat with automatic cannon fire. The gap between the torpedoes' running depth and the barge's shallow draft had been narrowed, not by a new torpedo, but by a gun stolen from the sky. There is a kind of poetry in that, but it should not be mistaken for simplicity. The P-39's 37-millimeter cannon was designed for air combat. It was placed in the nose of an airplane because engineers had built the aircraft around it. The Airacobra itself became controversial because it did not fully meet the high-altitude fighter role many expected. In the Pacific, some of its limitations were painful. Yet the very feature that made the airplane unusual became valuable after the airplane was wrecked. A failed or damaged machine did not become worthless. A part of it found a second life. That second life did not erase the losses. It did not bring back pilots. It did not undo the shelling of Henderson Field. It did not make the PT boats invulnerable. It did not turn every patrol into victory. But it did show something important about the men fighting in the islands. They were not passive users of equipment. They were problem solvers under fire. They learned that official design was only the beginning. A torpedo boat might need to become a gunboat. An aircraft cannon might need to become a deck gun. A weapon meant to shoot through a propeller might need to fire across black water at a barge's engine. A boat built to attack battleships and destroyers might spend its most important nights hunting supply craft close to shore. That is how the Pacific changed machines. And it changed men, too. Think of the crews at Tulagi in October 1942, awakened by the sound of Henderson Field being smashed. They climbed into boats that had only just arrived in the theater and ran toward gun flashes made by battleships. They claimed hits, endured searchlights and shellfire, and returned to a world still on fire. Their attack did not stop the Japanese bombardment, but it marked the beginning of a long, bitter education. Think of the mechanics and gunners looking at wrecked P-39s not only as destroyed airplanes, but as sources of usable weapons. That required a particular kind of imagination. Not the clean imagination of an inventor in a quiet room, but the practical imagination of men surrounded by shortage. Think of the crews who tried the single-shot M3 anti-tank gun, knowing it was awkward but better than nothing. That kind of improvisation looks crude only from a distance. Up close, it is evidence of men refusing to accept that the tools they had been issued were the only tools they could use. Think of Kennedy's PT-109, carrying that crude gun before it was lost. The famous story of Kennedy swimming with a wounded man has been told many times, sometimes with too much polish. But the gun on the bow shows another truth. Even before the loss of PT-109, Kennedy and his crew were part of the wider search for a way to kill barges. Think of PT-59 under Searles firing torpedoes at the Japanese submarine I-3. That action reminds us that the torpedo was not a useless weapon. It was simply a weapon with limits. Against a submarine on the surface, a torpedo could still be devastating. Against a shallow barge, it could pass beneath the target like a ghost. Think of PT-59 again, later under Kennedy, stripped of torpedoes and rebuilt as a gunboat. That is not a contradiction. It is evolution. The same hull number carried two lessons. The torpedo still mattered when the target was right, and guns mattered more when the target changed. Think of Choiseul, where the gunboat's value was not measured only in barges destroyed. It was measured in Marines taken aboard, in canned pichas passed to starving men, in a dead Marine, in the captain's bunk, and in a boat towed home after doing a job it did not have enough fuel to do. History is often remembered through machines. The P-39, the PT boat, the 37mm cannon, the 40mm Bofors, the Mark 8 torpedo. But machines only explain part of it. The deeper story is adaptation under pressure. The Americans did not enter the Solomons with a perfect answer. They entered with doctrine, courage, and equipment that sometimes failed the problem in front of them. The Japanese, for their part, were not foolish. They adapted as well. They used darkness, shallow water, barges, destroyers, and dispersal. They found ways to move supplies even when the sea and sky became dangerous. The barge war was not glamorous, but it was central to survival. A soldier who receives food because a barge got through can fight another day. A unit that receives ammunition can hold another ridge. A garrison that receives reinforcements can resist another landing. A campaign can turn on, whether enough small craft survive enough nights. That is why a 37mm cannon mattered. Not because it was the biggest gun in the Pacific. It was not. Not because it sank the most ships. It did not. Not because one dramatic night changed everything forever. That is too easy. It mattered because it filled a gap. It gave PT crews a practical weapon against a practical target. It helped turn the PT boat into a more flexible instrument of coastal war. It represented the moment when men stopped waiting for the original design to fit the battlefield and began reshaping the machine to fit the fight. There is also a lesson in the P-39 itself. In aviation history, the Airacobra is often judged by what it lacked. It lacked the high-altitude performance that would have made it a stronger interceptor in many situations. It lacked the reputation of the P-51 Mustang, the rugged fame of the P-47 Thunderbolt, or the naval romance of carrier fighters. Yet the P-39 was not meaningless. It served in many theaters, and its cannon became famous in an unexpected way among PT crews. A weapon's final usefulness is not always the one its designers imagined. The 37-millimeter gun was meant to fire from the nose of an aircraft. On Guadalcanal, its second life began closer to the waterline. It went from sky to sea, from fighter nose to boat bow, from air combat theory to a night fight against barges. That transformation is one of the reasons the story remains powerful. But to tell it honestly, we have to avoid making it too perfect. The first P-39 cannon mounted on a PT boat was not the single invention that saved the Solomons. The field modification was part of a broader pattern of increasing PT firepower. Other guns mattered. Other fronts mattered. New Guinea crews faced similar problems and helped develop similar solutions. The Navy's later standardization mattered. Kennedy's role was important, but should not swallow the whole story. He was one officer among many in a brutal small boat war, though his later fame makes his part easier to remember. And the men who died before the solution appeared must not be treated merely as setup. The night Henderson Field was bombarded was not valuable because it created wreckage. It was a disaster that men endured. The broken aircraft were not props. They represented lost resources, damaged machines, and sometimes dead pilots. The PT attacks that failed to stop Japanese warships were not failures of courage. They were collisions between brave crews and a battlefield that gave no easy reward. The power of the story comes from that honesty. The Americans did not turn failure into victory because they were destined to win. They did it because they had no choice. Every night, the barges might run again. Every night, supplies might reach Japanese troops. Every night, a PT boat might leave base and not return. Waiting for perfect equipment was not an option. So they used what the war had left behind. They took a cannon from a broken aircraft, and they built a mount. They tried it in the dark. When it worked, they used it again. When something heavier was needed, they added heavier guns. When torpedoes were less useful, they took them off some boats. When the mission changed, the boat changed. That is the real story of the Devil boats. Not a myth of flawless design. Not a simple tale of one heroic invention. Not a clean legend where every claim is confirmed and every dramatic scene happens exactly as told. The real story is rougher, but stronger. It begins with small wooden boats entering Iron Bottom Sound under the flashes of battleship guns. It passes through a shattered airfield where P-39s lay broken near Henderson Field. It moves into the shallow water war against Japanese barges, where torpedoes ran too deep and machine guns often hit too lightly. It touches PT-109, where Kennedy's crew tried a crude single-shot gun before disaster struck. It touches PT-59, first as a torpedo boat that helped sink a submarine, then as a gunboat that carried Kennedy to Choiseul. It widens to New Guinea and the wider Pacific, where other crews learned the same lesson in their own way. It ends not with one weapon, but with a transformation. The PT boat became a different thing. It remained fast, it remained dangerous, it remained fragile, but it was no longer only a torpedo boat. It had become a night fighter of the coastlines, a barge hunter, a gun platform, a rescue craft, a courier, a raider, and sometimes a shield between enemy fire and men trying to escape a beach. In that transformation, the 37mm P-39 cannon earned its place. A gun built for the nose of a fighter found another war on the bow of a boat. The men who made that happen were not thinking about museum displays or history books. They were thinking about the next patrol, the next barge, the next burst return fire, the next engine that might fail, the next friend who might not come back. They were not trying to create a symbol. They were trying to survive, top, and stop the enemy from moving supplies through the night. That is why the image remains so strong. A wooden boat in black water, a cannon taken from a dead airplane, a target too shallow for torpedoes, a crew too stubborn to accept that the official weapon was the only answer. When everything they had been given failed to solve the problem, they built what they needed from what the war had thrown away. Then they went back out into the dark.